viscous, dense darkness. It is not merely an absence of light. It seems like a palpable substance that fills the lungs, presses on the temples, and blurs the boundaries of reality. In this darkness, a person loses the sense of time but gains something else, a heightened sense of hearing, capable of catching the rustle of crumbling stone 100 meters away. A drop of water hitting the limestone floor sounds like a cannon shot here. It was this sound, the sound of a falling drop, that became the most longed-for symphony for thousands of people, for which it was worth continuing to breathe. Imagine a space where day and night do not alternate, where the temperature constantly hovers just above 10 degrees Celsius, and the air is so heavy that every breath requires an act of will. These are not the sets for a dystopian film, nor the fruit of a science fiction writer's imagination. This was the reality in which the defenders of Kerch found themselves in May 1942. Underground, in a labyrinth spanning tens of kilometers, a drama unfolded, unparalleled in its intensity and tragedy in world history. Here, deep within the stone, people held out for months against one of the most sophisticated war machines of the time, without a rear, without supplies, and without hope of swift liberation. To understand how such a situation became possible, one must mentally transport oneself to the surface, under the scorching Crimean sun of late spring 1942. The situation on the Crimean front developed catastrophically fast. After the breakthrough of German troops at the Adzhimushkay positions, the Soviet defense collapsed. Steppe Crimea turned into a trap. A huge mass of people and equipment retreated eastward to the Kerch Strait, hoping for evacuation to the Taman Peninsula. The chaos of the retreat, mixed with dust and smoke from incessant bombardments, created a picture of apocalypse. The crossings could not cope with the flow of retreating troops. Enemy aviation controlled the sky, methodically destroying everything that moved on the roads. In this maelstrom of events, the village of Adzhimushkay, located a few kilometers from Kerch, became a key point. It was here that a combined detachment under the command of Colonel Pavel Maximovich Yagunov took up defensive positions, covering the retreat of the main forces to the crossings. These places have been known for their quarries since ancient times. For centuries, shell rock was mined here for building houses, as a result of which a giant network of adits, corridors, and halls formed underground. No one then could have imagined that these industrial workings would become the last bastion for a huge garrison. When it became clear that holding ground positions was impossible and the paths to the crossing were cut off by breakthrough German tanks, the only way to salvation and continued struggle was to go underground. This was not a planned operation, a fortress prepared in advance with provisions and ammunition. It was a spontaneous, forced decision, dictated by the logic of survival and military duty. Not only soldiers and officers went into the dark mouths of the adits, but also civilians fleeing the advancing enemy. Women, old people, children, all of them sought refuge under the arches of the central and small quarries. Thus began this incredible story. From the very first hours, it became clear that underground life would differ dramatically from everything to which man was accustomed. The first and main problem was the complete lack of any infrastructure to accommodate such a mass of people. According to various estimates, between 10 and 15,000 people descended into the catacombs. Imagine the population of a small town, suddenly finding itself in an enclosed space without light, sewage, kitchens, or sleeping quarters. But the most terrible thing was not this. The most terrible thing was that the supplies of water and food were incredibly small. The garrison command, showing miracles of organizational ability, managed in the shortest possible time to establish something resembling army life. A headquarters was created, defense sectors were distributed, and unit commanders were appointed. The underground citadel began to live according to strict military regulations. However, the external enemy very soon realized that storming these labyrinths in a frontal attack was senseless. German soldiers who tried to penetrate the darkness of the adits encountered dagger fire and invisible traps. The stone reliably protected Soviet soldiers from artillery and aerial bombs. Then the enemy decided to change tactics and switched to a siege, using methods that can be characterized as inhumane and barbaric. The external contour of the conflict became extremely clear: a complete blockade. All exits from the catacombs were targeted, fenced with barbed wire and mined. But the stone breathed. The catacombs had thousands of natural cracks and vents through which air entered. Realizing this, the besiegers began to methodically blow up the entrances, causing collapses. Tons of rock crashed down, burying defenders and narrowing the living space. But even this did not break the resistance. The garrison responded with daring night sorties, inflicting sensitive damage on the enemy and seizing trophies. The confrontation entered a phase of war of attrition, where the enemy's main weapon was not bullets, but hunger, thirst, and, most terribly, chemical weapons. It was the use of asphyxiating gases that became the turning point, dividing the history of the defense into, quote, 0, quote, 1. On May 24, 1942, the enemy first used gas. Special sapper teams drilled holes in the arches of the catacombs or laid gas canisters with poisonous substances in the ventilation shafts and then pumped smoke with compressors. The gas, being heavier than air, slowly flowed down, filling lowlands, corridors, and halls. It was a silent, creeping threat from which it was impossible to hide. The defenders had critically few gas masks, and those that existed did not always save them from high concentrations of poisonous substances. People suffocated, lost consciousness, their lives fading in agony. The first gas attacks brought huge losses. The panic that gripped the underground in those hours could have been the end of the defense. But it was here that the second internal layer of conflict manifested itself: the struggle of the human spirit with animal fear. In conditions where every breath can be the last, when children suffer nearby, and there is no hope of outside help, the human psyche is subjected to colossal pressure. The temptation to go to the surface, raise one's hands and breathe fresh air was great. Enemy loudspeakers broadcast calls to surrender around the clock, promising hot food and water. But the garrison held firm. The command took tough but necessary measures to maintain discipline. Special gas shelters were organized, dead-end adits that were hung with raincoats, greatcoats, and blankets. During gas attacks, people rushed there, pressing the fabric tightly against the walls, creating an airtight barrier. They had to breathe through wet rags, and sometimes even through clumps of earth. Those who stood at the gas curtains acted as living filters, relieving each other when their strength failed them. It was an act of self-sacrifice performed in complete darkness. The internal conflict also lay in the need to share scarce resources. Water became the main value. All wells were outside, under enemy control. There was no water inside the quarries. People licked condensation from the walls, sucked moisture from the limestone. Special listener teams were created who searched for places where water was dripping. A vessel was placed under each such drip, and a sentry guarded it as the greatest sanctuary. The daily water ration reached 1 tablespoon, and this spoon was primarily given to the wounded, children, and machine gunners, who had to hold the defense. Attempts to get water from outside turned into real battles. There was an unspoken rule: a bucket of water, a bucket of blood. The defenders made desperate sorties to the external wells, often at the cost of their own lives, obtaining precious moisture. Understanding this, the garrison began to dig wells inside, in hard rock. Without special equipment, with picks and crowbars, in the stuffy, stale air, hungry people hammered the rock meter by meter. It was a titanic labor, a challenge to nature itself, and when, at a depth of more than 10 meters, water finally appeared, it became the greatest victory, comparable to a won battle. But besides the struggle for physical survival, there was a third, deepest layer of conflict, ideological and philosophical. Adzhimushkay became a symbol of the clash of two worldviews. On one side, a pragmatic, ruthless machine of destruction, confident that any person would break under the influence of physical deprivation. On the other, an irrational, from the enemy's point of view, resilience of people who refused to admit defeat even when it seemed inevitable. The defenders of the Quarries created a unique state underground. Here, in the depths of the earth, Soviet laws continued to operate. A headquarters worked, party and komsomol meetings were held, combat leaflets were issued. In conditions where the entire surrounding territory was captured, this underground garrison remained a part of an unconquered country. The soldiers understood that they were not just hiding, they were tying down significant enemy forces, preventing them from being transferred to other sectors of the front, where the fate of the Caucasus and Stalingrad was being decided. The realization of their mission gave meaning to their suffering. It was a paradox. People driven underground, deprived of light and air, felt free in their choice not to surrender. They called their garrison, quote, "two," and considered themselves full participants in a great war. The philosophy of resistance reached its climax here. This was a war not for territory in the usual sense, but for the right to remain human, for loyalty to the oath and comrades. Doctors operated on the wounded by the light of oil lamps, without anesthesia and medicines, achieving the impossible. Teachers tried to occupy the children, telling them stories to distract them from the horror of reality. All of them, from colonel to private, from old man to child, became a single organism, resisting entropy and decay. The situation transformed when it became clear that rapid help would not come. Hopes for a landing, which nourished the defenders in the first weeks, gradually melted away. Summer gave way to autumn. The garrison's forces were exhausted. From diseases, wounds, hunger, and exhaustion, dozens of people died every day. The space they defended narrowed due to constant demolitions and collapses. But it was at this moment, when physical strength was at its limit, that the spirit of resistance crystallized into something harder than stone itself. The defense ceased to be a passive waiting. It turned into a conscious service until the last breath. People ceased to fear the end of life. They feared only one thing: an inglorious end, oblivion, and betrayal. In the diaries found by searchers decades later, there are no complaints. There is only a statement of facts, farewells to loved ones, and an endless faith in victory, which they might not see, but in which they have no doubt. The culmination of this tragedy stretched on for many months. By the end of summer 1942, organized resistance became practically impossible due to the critical reduction in the garrison's numbers. From a multi-thousand-strong army, only small groups of emaciated people, resembling shadows, remained. They could no longer conduct large sorties, but continued to hold their sectors. The enemy, unable to break them with gas and starvation, switched to a tactic of total annihilation, literally blowing up the rock above their heads. Powerful explosive charges shook the earth, collapsing the ceilings of the halls. The underground fortress was shrinking, turning into a mass grave. The last radio messages sent from the quarries are full of tragedy and grandeur. To all, to all, to all, peoples of the Soviet Union! We, the defenders of Kerch, are suffocating from gas, dying, but not surrendering. These words breaking through the air became the garrison's testament. At the end of October 1942, after 170 days of heroic defense, the last pockets of resistance were suppressed. Only a few survived, those who were unconscious and captured, and those few who managed to slip through the encirclement. The enormous underground city fell silent. Darkness once again became the mistress of the labyrinth, embracing thousands of fates interrupted mid-sentence. But this silence was deceptive. The history of Adzhimushkay did not end with the last shot. It transitioned into another dimension, the dimension of memory and historical resonance. The lessons we can draw from this history today extend far beyond military strategy. Adzhimushkay teaches us that the limits of human capabilities are much broader than we are accustomed to thinking. In a comfortable world, where the absence of Wi-Fi is perceived as a problem, it is difficult to imagine that a person can maintain clarity of mind and dignity spending months in complete darkness, subsisting on a handful of grain and a gulp of stale water. This is a story about the power of collectivism, about how one can survive and preserve one's human dignity only by supporting each other. A loner in those conditions was doomed to madness and death. Only the sense of camaraderie, a common goal, and responsibility to comrades allowed people to withstand inhumane loads. Moreover, Adzhimushkay is a reminder of the price of peace. Every meter of these adits is permeated with suffering, but also with incredible love for life and for one's motherland. These are not grandiloquent words, but a reality confirmed by every artifact found. A half-rotted cartridge case, a child's toy, a rusted helmet. These objects speak to us louder than any textbooks. They tell us that heroism is not always a beautiful attack with a flag in hand. Often it is a quiet, daily, exhausting struggle to overcome oneself. It is the ability to give the last piece of bread to another. It is the decision to remain human in inhumane conditions. Today, descending into the Adzhimushkay Museum, visitors feel the same cold and the same darkness. Guides ask them to turn off their flashlights for a minute so that people can feel what the defenders felt. And in this minute of silence, in absolute darkness, an invisible dialogue of generations takes place. We understand that our everyday problems are insignificant compared to what these people experienced. And at the same time, we draw strength from their example. If they were able to endure then, it means that human nature holds an enormous potential for resilience and courage. As we conclude this narrative, let us mentally return to the beginning, to the sound of a falling drop of water. Now it is perceived not merely as a physical phenomenon, but as a metaphor for time. Drop by drop, day by day, year by year, time wears away stone, but it has no power over memory. The stone of Adzhimushkay has become a monument not only to war, but to an unyielding spirit. It holds within it the voices of those who remained there forever, who by their feet proved that even in the deepest darkness, the light of the human soul cannot be extinguished. The light ignited by the defenders of Adzhimushkay continues to shine upon us through the decades, reminding us of who we are and what we are capable of for what we believe in. the underground citadel of Kerch remains an eternal sentinel, guarding the boundaries of our conscience and our memory, reminding us that true victory is the triumph of spirit over circumstances, of life over oblivion. The depth of the Adzhimushkay tragedy is revealed not only through the overall picture of the siege, but also through the thousands of micro-stories from which this history is woven. It is important to understand precisely how life was organized in this underground city to comprehend the scale of the feat. For it is not merely about sitting in darkness, but about the functioning of a complex social system under extreme conditions. Colonel Yagunov, understanding that chaos was the main enemy, immediately instituted a rigid vertical of power. The entire garrison was divided into battalions and companies, each responsible for its sector of defense. Special search parties, reconnaissance, and a commandant's platoon were formed. There was even an underground hospital where doctors performed true miracles. Imagine an operating room where, instead of sterile lamps, torches made from car tires or flattened cartridge cases filled with fuel oil burn. Soot settles on faces, on gowns, on the hands of surgeons. Instruments are boiled in the same water saved for drinking. Anesthesia is practically non-existent. The wounded, understanding the situation, endured terrible pain, trying not to groan so as not to frighten others. Doctors, themselves exhausted and falling from fatigue, continued to operate for days, extracting shrapnel, amputating limbs, dressing wounds. They fought for every life to the last. It was here, in the hospital, that the line between life and its end was most acutely felt. But even here, amidst pain and suffering, there was room for hope. Nurses, barely alive from hunger themselves, found words of comfort, stroked the hands of the soldiers, replacing their mothers and wives. The history of the gas wars deserves special attention. After the first, most devastating attacks, the garrison learned to counter this threat. An entire system of warning and defense was created. Observation posts were stationed along the entire perimeter. As soon as a sentry noticed suspicious commotion at the entrances or heard the sound of compressors, an alarm signal was relayed down the chain. People instantly donned gas masks or pressed wet bandages to their faces. Those not involved in the defense retreated deeper into the distant adits. Special chemical defense units were formed which tried to block gas penetration points by barricading them with stones and sandbags. It was a constant, grueling duel of intellects and technologies. The Germans devised new ways to deliver poisonous substances, and the defenders found new ways to protect themselves. One of the most dramatic aspects of the defense was the fate of the children. Several hundred children of various ages found themselves in the quarries. For them, the underground became a home, a school, and a playground. The adults tried their best to shield them from the horrors of what was happening. Children were given the best pieces of meager food, an extra gulp of water. They even tried to organize a semblance of an educational process for them to distract them from fear. But the children matured here not by the day but by the hour. The small inhabitants of the underground perfectly understood what was happening. They learned to distinguish types of explosions, knew how to behave during a gas attack, and helped care for the wounded. Their eyes, accustomed to the darkness, saw things that a child's eye should not see. The tragedy of children's lives, cut short or maimed by war in these underground passages, remains one of the most painful pages in the history of Adzhimushkay. The psychological state of people is a separate, profound topic. Constant darkness affects the brain in a specific way. Hallucinations begin, and orientation in time is lost. People started seeing light where there was none, hearing the voices of relatives. To combat this, Commanders and political workers constantly held conversations, made people do something, move, perform tasks. Idleness was akin to death. Lectures were given in the underground, literary works were recalled, and songs were sung in a low voice. There is evidence that even a handwritten newspaper was published. Humor, albeit bitter, also helped to survive. Jokes about the enemy, about their situation, allowed them to relieve psychological tension. During one period of the siege, the defenders faced a new threat: betrayal. Not everyone could withstand the inhuman tension. There were cases when people tried to defect to the enemy, to reveal the location of posts or warehouses. Such individuals were dealt with according to wartime laws, harshly and uncompromisingly. But such cases were negligible compared to the mass heroism. Most understood that surrender was not salvation, but shame and probable death. Loyalty to the oath held them stronger than the stone vaults. By midsummer, the food situation became critical. The supplies brought with them had long run out. The hunting of rats began, and everything that could be chewed was eaten. Leather belts, shoe soles, technical grease. Hunger changed people externally, turning them into living skeletons, but it could not break their inner core. It was during this period, when physical strength was at its limit, that the strength of spirit was most clearly manifested. People shared their last cracker, supported those who fell from weakness. There are known cases when soldiers refused their rations in favor of comrades who had to go into battle or on duty. This is the highest form of humanism, demonstrated in hell. Separately, it is worth mentioning the role of women in the defense. They were not only medics and signal operators, but also took up arms when men were incapacitated. The care of daily life, the wounded, and the children fell on their shoulders. Their resilience and patience were an example for many men. Women washed bandages in cold, dirty water, prepared meager food from nothing, maintained cleanliness as much as possible. Their presence softened the harsh male existence, reminded them of peaceful life, of the home they were fighting for. The tension grew every day. The enemy, irritated by the stubbornness of the underground rats, as they called the defenders, brought new forces to Adzhimushkay. Super-heavy aerial bombs designed to destroy fortifications were used. Airstrikes caused powerful ground tremors. It seemed as if the sky itself wanted to crush the recalcitrant. The vaults cracked, huge blocks fell down, blocking passages. People constantly had to clear debris, restore communications. It was an endless Sisyphean task. But the garrison wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back. Scouts, wrapping rags around their feet to muffle their steps, would emerge to the surface through narrow crevices known only to them. They attacked German patrols, mined roads, and destroyed equipment. These ghosts of the night struck terror into the occupiers. The Germans feared the darkness, feared every bush, every stone. They understood that the land beneath their feet was not conquered, that it was alive and dangerous. Adzhimushkay tied up significant enemy forces, forcing them to keep an entire division around the Quarries. Every day won by the defenders gave the country a chance to gather strength, to prepare reserves. And yet, the end was inevitable. The resources of the human body are not limitless. By autumn, the garrison's activity had decreased. People could no longer move quickly. Many were bedridden. But the posts were not abandoned. Sentries were tied to rock ledges so they wouldn't fall from weakness. Weapons remained in their hands until the last moment. When Soviet troops liberated Kerch in 1944, they found traces of this great tragedy in the quarries. Walls covered with farewell messages, remains of heroes frozen with weapons in hand, children's toys covered with a layer of stone dust. The scene that unfolded shocked even seasoned frontline soldiers. It became clear that something more than just a military operation had taken place here. It was an act of spiritual self-determination. People, left deep behind enemy lines, cut off from the mainland, chose their own path. They could have surrendered, but they chose honor and loyalty. This choice makes the history of Adzhimushkay universal. It is understandable in any language, in any culture. It is a story of dignity that cannot be taken away by force, of freedom that lives within a person, even if they are chained in stone. Today's research conducted by search teams continues to open new pages of this epic. Every year, expeditions descend to find and rebury the remains of soldiers, restore their names, and read half-decayed documents. This is work to reclaim memory. For until the last soldier is buried, the war is not over, and Adzhimushkay still holds its defense, now against oblivion. Found medallions, letters, and personal belongings allow us to reconstruct the fates of specific individuals, turning faceless casualty statistics into living history. We learn about young lieutenants who took command, about ordinary soldiers who performed acts of self-sacrifice. The Adzhimushkay Quarries are a place of power. Upon entering here, a person inevitably changes. They begin to feel more acutely the value of simple things: sunlight, a sip of water, the ability to breathe deeply. They begin to understand that complaints about everyday difficulties are often unfounded. This place teaches humility and gratitude. Gratitude to those who remained down there so that we could live up here. Concluding the narrative, I want to emphasize once again the paradox of the situation. Underground, in hell, people preserved more humanity than those who were above, under the sun, but with the invader's weapon in their hands. The moral height of the defenders of Adzhimushkay proved unattainable for the enemy. They won not by the force of weapons, but by the strength of spirit. Their silence today sounds louder than any fanfare. And each of us, encountering this story, must ask ourselves, could I have done it? Would I have had the strength not to break, not to betray, to remain human? Everyone seeks the answer to this question themselves, but the example of Adzhimushkay gives us a guide, a high standard to strive for. This story is an eternal reminder that a person is great, not by what they have, but by what they are willing to give for others. The darkness of the quarries preserves this light, and as long as we remember, it will not fade. This is the main legacy of the underground garrison: faith in the indestructibility of the human spirit.